Well, each vessel travels along a vector through space-time along its center of gravity.
Like a spear.
I beg your pardon?
Like a spear that comes out of your chest.
Sure, yeah. And in order for the vessel to travel through time, it's got to find a porthole, or in this case, a wormhole, or...
Well, could these portals just appear anywhere, anytime?
I think that's highly unlikely. No, I think what you're talking about is an act of God.
Well, if God controls time, then all time's pre-decided.
I'm not following you.
Like, every living thing follows along set path. And if you could see your path or channel, then you could see into the future, right? Like, that's a form of time travel.
Well, you're contradicting yourself, Donnie. If we were able to see our destinies manifest themselves visually, then we would be given a choice to betray our chosen destinies. And the mere fact that this choice exists would make all preformed destiny come to an end.
Not if you travel within God's channel.
I'm not going to be able to continue this conversation.
Why?
I could lose my job.
Okay.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I am welcoming a new guest, and that is Matt Farley. Matt, how you doing today?
Great. Thanks for inviting me. It's here.
Glad to have you on. A mutual friend of ours, Alex Marcus, who's been a guest on the show many times. He put us in touch, and he thought you'd be a good guest, and I'm always happy to listen to his recommendations. So here we are. But before we get started about too much about today's movie, today we will be talking about the 2001 film Donnie Darko. But first, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I have a sort of long history in the superhero genre, which I'm sure we'll get into. My day job, I work for a university. I'm an accessibility specialist, so I do things like make sure our online courses are accessible for people with disabilities. In my free time, I'm, doing a lot of comic book related stuff. I run a Marvel fan site. I'm also a writer, so I have a new book sort of in the works that I love to talk about. But yeah, I have all sorts of stuff going on at the moment.
Very cool. My day job is also working at a university, though, on the teaching side. Why don't you tell us about your Marvel fan site? What's your site?
Sure, it's called marvelguides.com. It's a reading order site, and this was there's a bunch of reading order sites out there, but this was sort of born out of my own personal journey trying to read pretty much every Marvel comic from the 1960s to now, and finding that a lot of the sites out there didn't have a ton of great orders that were either made sense or were easy to follow. So I sort of started creating my own reading orders as I was going through my own reading journey, and I figured it'd be worth just sharing with people since I spent so much time on it. And it's a constant work in progress. It's not complete, so people are always asking me for updates. But I have a fair amount, several thousand issues, sort of in different orders that I find flow best, not only from a continuity perspective, but just also from a pure reading experience. Like I try not to make it so you're switching between series every issue. I try to put like series together when I can, so it's more of a better flow when whether you're in the Marvel Unlimited app or pulling out issues you own. So yeah, it's just been sort of a fun side project to share that with the world and see what people think. But like I said, there's a ton of great reading order websites out there, and also you don't need to read every single Marvel comic or DC comic in order, because that's not really how they were meant to be read, but it's just a fun thing that I like to try to figure out in my head.
I've been to your website before, so and I have used it.
Cool.
Yeah, your reading guides are very cool, and I've seen it referenced on Reddit a few times as well. I see you also got MCU viewing guides on there too.
Yep.
And yeah, these sites are very helpful. One of my bugaboos with comics, the Marvel and DC these days, is that even on the app, the reading orders are not always that great, and they
No.
don't always flow logically from one thing to the next. And even in sometimes the trades, they're not always compiled in the best reading order. I read the what was it, Death Metal, the DC crossover from a few
Oh,
years
right.
ago.
Yeah.
and it was across like three trades. So there was the death metal trade, there was like Tales of the Dark Multiverse, and there was another one. I think it was also I can't remember the other one. But the different series they weave in together. And there's also
Hmm.
stuff from like the Justice League comic that's also very crucial to understanding it. So I read the core death metal book first, and then I figured I'll read the other ones are just tie-in stuff. But I read the core book and I'm like, I don't understand anything that happened here. This doesn't make any sense. And then I found out that, oh yeah, it's because all this other stuff is connected in there that DC just decided they're not going to include
Yep.
in that in the same book, which drove me nuts. And then eventually I had to, it was through, not your site, but it was another site I found that had a reading order, and I was able to read it again. I'm like, okay, now it makes sense somewhat.
Yeah, and
The event was kind of
that's
a
a
mess
really
though.
complicated that's a complicated storyline too. So
Yeah,
yeah.
so yeah, these reading guides, yeah, I mean, the you and other guys like you who are doing this, you guys are doing the definitely doing good work out there. It's very helpful for a lot of readers. And I agree with you. Yeah, I so many times I'm on the Reddit forums and I see people come in who are just new to Marvel or DC and they're like, "Oh, I just got a subscription to Marvel Unlimited or DC Universe Infinite and I want to read everything. So I want to start from the
Right.
beginning and how do I read it all?" I'm like, "No, no, don't do that. You'll drive yourself crazy."
Yeah, I think there's, 20,000 Marvel comics. And honestly, probably half of them are not great. So if you have limited time and you really just want to focus on the best of the best, they do a pretty good job of having new jumping on points every few years without doing a full reboot, when they do like a new arc or a new writer comes on. So they do a pretty good job of catching you up. You don't really need to read everything to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I usually tell people like, who are you interested in, and then pick a good. We can give you recommendations for jumping on points from there, and then,
Yep.
but usually you find a number one these days, and you're pretty much okay for the most part. Um, but so before we dive too much into other stuff, let's talk a little bit about your book. What's your book all about?
Sure. So this book is called The Last Beacon. I've been working on it for 6 or 7 years. It takes place in the 90s in a small town. On the surface, it's sort of a murder mystery horror story. It starts with a boy that's found dead on top of a lighthouse and the investigation that sort of spirals out from there. But it's really inspired by my love of actually some TV shows like Twin Peaks, Lost, X-Files, sort of in that vein. So it's sort of a mystery that has sort of horror elements, but the further you get into it, you realize it's a sort of a larger science fiction tale involving, alternate universes and mind control and all sorts of stuff. So it's really a blend of genres, sort of pulling in all the different types of stories I'm interested in. And it is currently on a site called Inkshares. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a crowdfunding site for authors. It's a little different from something like Kickstarter in that you're not really raising money per se. You're trying to get a certain number of pre-orders. And if the book gets a certain number of pre-orders, Inkshares is also the publisher, so that'll sort of prove to them that the book has enough reader interest. So unlike a traditional publisher where writers, submit manuscripts and hope they get noticed, Inkshares likes to publish books that readers are interested in. So, if you're interested in checking it out, I have a few chapters online for you to read at lastbeaconbook.com. And then if it sounds good to you, you can pre-order it there. And like I said, if I get enough pre-orders, then I'll get a publishing deal and it will take off from there and it'll, end up in bookstores and online and all that good stuff eventually. So yeah, I'd love for anyone to check out the chapters and if you like it, support the book.
Okay, very cool. Well, we will definitely have links to that in the show notes, so people should go ahead
Cool.
and
Appreciate
check
it.
that out. Man, 6 or 7 years, it's a long time to be working on the book. Are
Yeah, I took a little break in the middle. I had a kid, we moved, I got sort of sidetracked. A lot of people started hobbies during COVID, but for me, I sort of like retreated just to focusing on like gaming and TV shows, and I sort of lost some of my drive to write. But I wrote about three-fourths of it before COVID, and then the last year or two, I picked it back up and finished it and refined it. So it's at a place now where I'm pretty happy with.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, independent author myself here. So one of the important things
Nice.
I definitely know is trying to get as much writing done as you can, and also the struggle of doing that with kids. I'm not sure how old
Yep.
your kids are, but mine are 5 and 3.5 right now, and
Okay.
when they're home, it's almost impossible to get anything done.
Yeah, I've got a 7-year-old. That's I'm actually in my basement right now because my office is right on the other side of his room. So can't really be podcasting at this time of night for me. But so I have a setup in the basement where you can't hear me. So yeah, he's hopefully his mom will prevent him from running down and interrupting the show. I think we're good.
Well, I think we're okay. We're okay, even if he does. Like, listeners of the show are very used to my kids popping up
Okay,
occasionally.
good.
But how did you get into superheroes in the first place? What is your own superhero fan origin story?
For me, it really centered around Spider-Man in the 90s, sort of the one, two, three punch of the animated series in the middle of the 90s. I think that's really my first introduction, along with some of like the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games that accompanied those things. Soon after that, I started picking up issues. I remember my first was Amazing Spider-Man 425, just a random issue with him and Electro, but that just happened to be the first one, so it always sticks in my mind. And then
Is
from
that
there, I
the
was
one
only,
with? Is that the one with X-Man guest starring in it?
oh, you nailed it. Yeah, exactly.
I know that. I fond memories of reading that in the shop back in the day.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so I was born in 89, so that I was like, 7 or 8 at that point. But yeah, my dad was really supportive of me getting into comics because I love drawing too. So I draw the issues. And so I got a pull list pretty quickly from our local comic book store. And then soon after that was the first Raimi Spider-Man movie, which blew me away in theaters. So for a really long time, I was solely sort of a Spider-Man guy. And then in the last, once I was in college, I was sort of getting a little bored of just being solely Spider-Man. So I started to branch out to indie stuff, DC, other Marvel characters. I sort of just absorbed all of it. And, right around that time was when the Dark Knight was coming out and the MCU was starting to pick up. So that just sort of further fueled my love of the genre. And of course, it's had its ups and downs over the years, but yeah, it's been a very consistent thing in my life, though I would say Spider-Man is always that sort of foundation that I gravitate towards.
Very cool. Yeah, we got similar stories. I got a few
Cool.
years on you, but for me it was the X-Men animated series when that hit in '92, and that and Batman the animated series, and those two things, and more X-Men than anything else. It pushed me into getting comics, and like you, I was very heavily focused just on that one thing. So for me, it was X-Men for a good amount of years. And then when I was in high school, I started working at a comic book shop and gave me more disposable income and more time to get exposed to different books. And I kind of like branched out and I got sort of like consumed all the Marvel stuff I can get my hands on. And then slowly from there branched out into DC as well. And then obviously the movies kicked into high gear too, and that just kind of like fueled things faster.
Yeah.
And now it's basically my life for the for the most part. um, but man, yeah, like getting into comics in those days, the mid late '90s, that was you talk about people getting into stuff now and needing reading orders. Back then, it was like a gauntlet because you jump into
Oh yeah.
something like the any of the X-Men ongoing storylines they had back then, or Spider-Man in the mid '90s. It was the Clone Saga and all of
Yeah.
that, and trying
I
to
mean,
follow everything.
I would say basically from the early 80s up through like some of the reboots like the new 52 for DC and I think it was Marvel Now for Marvel, which wasn't a full reboot, but it was really a fresh jumping on point. Up until those points, I would say for 20 to 30 years, they really were continuous storylines, for better or worse. So like you're saying, if you jumped into an X-Men book in the mid 90s, not only was it probably in the middle of like a 15-part storyline, there were 8 other X-Men books that it was crossing over to, and often you would have to buy multiple series just to get the full story. They're pretty good about not doing that now. They'll have like Civil War, whatever the big event is, but they're pretty good about not having like, you don't have to read Amazing Spider-Man for part one of a story and then Uncanny X-Men for part two of it. But back in the 90s, they were doing everything they could to get you to buy as many series as possible.
Yeah, for me, the big crossover at that time was Onslaught, and if they were doing that
Oh
today, that
yeah.
would be like a maxi series of its own, just titled Onslaught,
Yep.
and then but instead it was just all through the main book. So trying to piece that together was definitely an exercise.
Yep.
But anyway, what kind of stuff are you interested in lately? Anything that's grabbing your attention?
I'm a pretty big gamer, so I've been revisiting Fallout 4. I haven't seen the new season of the show yet, but I caught up with season one a couple months ago, and that sort of reinvigorated my interest in the games. I've already beaten Fallout 4 in the past, but it's been about 8 or 9 years, so I figured I'd check it out again, because it's probably going to be quite a while till the next one comes. Really looking forward to Resident Evil Requiem, which is coming out next week. Been playing some Arc Raiders. I'm not usually a multiplayer guy, but that's been a pretty fun, intense experience. So yeah, pretty much gaming right now. Otherwise, for sort of nerd culture stuff, my son has just gotten into One Piece, which I've been a long time fan of, but I've been able to re-experience the manga and the anime through his eyes, and he has so many questions about it, and he has so many, favorite characters and moves and things like that. So it's fun to now that my son he's almost 8 now, probably a little young for One Piece at certain points, but he's dealing with it. It's fun to watch to revisit some of these things that have been going on for decades, starting in my childhood now through his eyes.
Yeah, that is very cool. Like my kids haven't quite got into anime stuff so much, except for like the kids anime that's popular here in Japan. But
Hmm.
they are interested in they're getting interested in superhero stuff. Like my son goes nuts for Spidey and His Amazing Friends. He watches it practically
Oh,
on damn near
yeah.
repeat. And that's been great because it actually annoys my wife sometimes because he only wants to wear his Spider-Man t-shirts even when they're all in the wash, and he's always wants to, like, go to bed with his Spider-Man toy or something, read his Spider-Man, picture books at night. And whenever he's like complaining he can't find some Spider-Man thing, my wife just glares at me. She's like, "This is your fault." And I'm like, "Yep, I know, and I'm
Yep.
proud of it." I make no apologies.
It
Yeah, for my part.
it
Oh,
makes
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say it makes, birthday presents and stuff easy. There's no shortage of superhero stuff out there. So.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. For my part, I was actually diving into back into Doomsday Clock, the DC pseudo
Oh,
Watchmen
nice.
cross sequel, and I really enjoyed it. We covered it way back on one of the old comic book episodes, which I have to re-upload to the feed now that we've started the comic book section of this show. But I was reading it because we had a guest on the comic book show recently, Tyler Patrick of Krypton Report, and we were talking about Three Jokers, and that also kind of led into a tangential discussion about Doomsday Clock with Johns also did, and with Three Jokers, it was kind of, yeah, there was some okay, it was kind of like okay with it, but Doomsday Clock really impressed me in a lot of ways, and so I'm planning to be on his show again soon, and so rereading that and just really digging it. It was just, I don't know if you're a fan of Doomsday Clock or
Nice.
if you've read it at all, but I really liked what it had to say about the meta commentary about like Watchmen's effect on the comic industry and Superman's importance, and how it kind of like, you know, not really like, it was kind of like a debate between those two things. It was kind of like
Hmm.
John's having a sort of a one-sided debate with Alan Moore, which I found interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. I really enjoyed the Watchmen HBO series as well. I don't know if you saw
Yes.
that, but yeah, it's interesting because, Alan Moore is so against any continuations, and it did seem very sacred for a certain amount of time. Watchmen is a commentary on superheroes in many ways and society, and it's like even this has become turned into a franchise, and it could have gone wrong so easily, but I think they've been pretty careful and when they've chosen to let other creators expand it, and they've really saved it for when people have a great idea. So yeah, I've enjoyed all the Watchmen stuff. I think there are some Watchmen prequel comics that weren't great, but otherwise, there's been some pretty cool Watchmen stuff over the last few years.
Yeah, there's the before Watchmen stuff. I haven't read any of those, but I heard the Darwin Cook stuff, the Minutemen stuff, was pretty good.
Oh yeah.
And then Tom King did a Rorschach miniseries recently, which I heard was very good. And the thing about Doomsday Clock, and I'm not going to go on too big of a tangent here, but the thing about Doomsday Clock that I that was kind of a weird feeling is like the first half is very much a Watchmen sequel, which as a Watchmen sequel I didn't like. I love the HBO series. I feel like that's a much better sequel to
Hmm.
the story.
I
But
agree, yeah.
when the second half, when it got into the Superman stuff, then I'm like, okay, now I'm really vibing with this. Now I'm really digging it. And I think that I kind of wish that Johns had balanced that out a little bit more, but that aside, I really enjoyed it for what it was. But yeah, that HBO series, man, we did a 3-part episode covering that way back in the early days of the show, and that was just such a blast to watch. I really dug all the stuff it was doing there,
Yeah.
and it showed that, and I was against it at first because I was like, Watchmen doesn't need a sequel, but after watching that, I'm
Right.
like, okay, no, I was wrong.
Yeah, because I mean, just like the original graphic novel, it does things that you would never expect. It's not just reiterating what came before. So I think that really helped.
Anyway, so today we are talking about Donnie Darko, 2001. Um, this is one of those movies that it's not technically a superhero film, but it's kind of like on the line. And at one point, Gretchen, Jenna Malone's character, asks Donnie if he's a superhero, and you know what? I'm gonna go with it. So, and it's my show. I make the rules. I'm gonna say we're gonna qualify it as a superhero movie. What is your history with Donnie Darko?
This is a movie that I saw, I wouldn't say in high school for the first time. I definitely didn't see it right when it came out. But it was one of those movies that some of my friends who were a little more into weirder and offbeat movies than me, I would hear them quote the lines from over and over again. And it's one of those things that would be described to me. There's this guy and a guy in a bunny suit and these weird wormholes coming out of people. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? This sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Very similar experience with one of my other favorite things, Lost, where people would describe the first season of that to me like, oh, there's a polar bear on an island. Like this sounds so stupid. But then I watched it, I was like, oh wow, the descriptions weren't doing it justice. So when I finally sat down and watched it, it definitely resonated with me at times. It sort of veers in between feeling it like it's trying to like maybe imitate like a David Lynch type film, but it's very unique in a way. It's like if David Lynch did like a John Hughes film, almost like a high school story with these weird touches. So yeah, it was something that I eventually caught, I think, in high school and stuck with me. It's something I haven't revisited a lot. I actually watched it last year for the first time again, and then I watched it this week to prepare for the show. But so much of it was stuck in my mind just from that first viewing many years ago. That yeah, I think it's just a really unique movie, and it definitely has flaws. It's not perfect, but it's something I think everyone should see at least one time.
Yeah, so for me, I was probably in university when I saw this, and it was one of those movies that I found. So I was that guy in my friend group that was showing everybody all the weird movies, and I was always picking up different stuff that was on sale or stuff from like DVD shops, and I think this was like one of those like $10 Best Buy purchases or something like that, and I can't remember how I kind of stumbled on. I think I may have heard something about it because I do have memories of watching the trailer before I actually watched the movie. And that may have just been I had the DVD and I watched the trailer on the DVD or something like that. And I remember there were scenes that really kind of stood out to me in the trailer, like the one of him like with the knife and banging it on the barrier and
Oh
like
yeah.
Frank like reacting to it. That was one that really kind of stood out to me in it, and the other one with him and Gretchen and Frank in the movie theater was another one that stood out to me. And so it was a very interesting movie, and I remember really liking it, and it was one of those movies that was on a probably like with your friends, like I was showing this to many different people, and it
Yep.
was one of those movies that we put on a pretty regular rotation whenever we had new people come into the group or something like that, like, oh, we got to watch Donnie Darko. It was kind of like a rite of passage kind of thing in some ways.
Yeah.
um and yeah, but also like you, I didn't see it again for a long time. In fact, I had because the version I had was the original DVD version, which is the theatrical cut, and at some point I had swapped that out for the director's cut. But and this happens a lot because I've got way too many movies, but there are a lot of movies that I will buy and then I will not watch them for years.
Same here. Same here.
Yeah. I've got stuff that I bought on whenever we go back to the States, we always drop by like some secondhand DVD shops because now they're like $2 a pop there.
Yeah.
And I still have stuff from a trip we took about like 4 years ago sitting on my Plex server that I've still not watched. It's probably something even older than that I still haven't watched. Um, but and so that director's cut was one I picked up, and it wasn't until about maybe it was about a year ago that I one of the classes I teach is a night class, and it's for advanced English students, and I use movies in the class. And so the students pick the movie, and I give them a list of all my movies on Letterbox, and they picked Donnie Darko. And so I'm like, okay, fine. This was the chance to watch the director's cut for the first time about last year. And so I really, because the first time I watched, I couldn't really understand it. And after watching
Yeah.
the director's cut, it makes a little bit more sense. I still think there's some things that I'm not quite 100% sure on, but I think the way you described it is, as David Lynch doing John Hughes really fits, especially like the '80s setting and all of that. Like
Yeah.
it is this weird crossover because you've got this small town setting which Lynch uses a lot. You've got the whole um false facade of perfect suburbia with like this dark underside to it. And then
Yep.
you've got these weird, trippy things happening in the midst of all of that. But then you have this teen drama aspect too. So yeah, it is a really interesting movie in that way.
Yeah, and from what I understand, one of the main differences between the two versions is the director's cut goes a little bit more into the actual scientific explanations behind what is happening in terms of the actual mechanics of the time travel and the wormhole. So I think that's kind of cool. Like if you're someone who sorts of just wants to just like vibe out and have the visuals and story wash over you, you can watch the original. And then I would say probably start with that one. And then if you're a little confused and are a little bit more interested in the mechanics of the plot and how certain things get from point A to B, then the director's cut will probably clear a little bit of that up for you, like you're saying. But even then, there's still probably a lot open to interpretation.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think, and I mentioned this to my students because I was talking to them about it, and I mentioned how because one of the big differences is not only do they go into some of the detail, but they actually have like the pages from Roberta Sparrow's book
Oh, right, right.
up on the screen, so that really helps lay some of the stuff out. Um, and it's written in kind of like cryptic language, so it's not always 100% clear, but there are also a lot of guides online that make it a lot easier to kind of figure out what's happening. There are still questions about it. But what were some of the things that kind of jumped out in you in this time?
Um, let's see. I really like the family dynamic in a weird way. Like I feel like in a lot of movies like this, or even TV shows like Stranger Things and stuff like that, where there's like kids and supernatural stuff going on, the parents are always either very aloof or very dismissive or mean, or they just don't seem like real characters. But I feel like the mom and dad in this were very involved in the story. They had like some scenes on their own, with other characters that weren't just them reacting to what Donnie was doing. And I thought it was interesting because it's like on the surface, he has like a decent support system, a decent family life. He clearly has some level of mental illness that he's being treated for. But I really like just the whole dynamic of how the family played off each other. And even when he like got in trouble at school, they weren't just like, outright dismissive of him. Like the dad and even the mom are sometimes on his side a bit. So it sort of makes it a little bit of a happier movie in some regards, if, not to jump too far ahead, but at the end of the movie, he essentially, in a way, sacrifices himself to save, not only his family, but presumably the whole world. Um, and it's interesting that, he gets to live a little bit of a life, but also give up, the rest of his life for the greater good. And I like that he has sort of an interesting supportive home life because it's not like he just had this horrible life where his parents had no clue what was going on with him or didn't give a shit about him. And yeah, that for some reason the family dynamic is what I really honed in on in this most recent viewing.
I agree. Yeah, the family dynamic was really impressive for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned. And it's it's interesting because it opens up, and the political side of things also kind of jumped out at me on this
Oh yeah.
viewing of it. And but the whole idea of like them having this kind of like political debate about it, and even though Elizabeth, his sister, is obviously, is talking about voting for Dukakis, and the father is like, he's not shooting her down, but he's trying
Hmm.
to, they're actually discussing it. Um, and in a way, he's maybe a tad bit condescending in the conversation, but then it shifts into like this swearing match between Donnie and Elizabeth, and then and then everything gets quiet, and then the Samantha asks, "What's a fuck ass?" The dad just
Right.
starts laughing, and that's it's funny because I kind of imagine like that's kind of the kind of stuff that I see happening in my family. Like when my kids swear
Oh
something,
yeah.
because I swear a lot, and I just laugh, and then my wife scolds me. She's like, "Don't laugh at that." I'm like, "It was
Yeah.
funny. What do you want me to do?"
Yeah. It was very realistic. Yeah.
Mhm. And also there's another thing that stood out to me too. And I agree with you too. When Donnie gets into trouble at school, they're not quick to judge him as if like, well, the school's always right, you're always wrong. And it's
Right.
also kind of funny that the fact that they are Republicans, because they're very understanding of like breaking against authority, which is kind of
Hmm.
interesting, I thought. But it was this kind of idea, which is, I think maybe a lot of it is probably just and I'll get more into the political side of things later, but I think it might be just this idea of they're upper middle class suburban people, so they're voting Republican, maybe because like they've always voted Republican type of thing. My mom was one of those
Probably.
people up until the last election. But it's like it's the Republican Party doesn't actually reflect the values that they actually believe in, other than
Hmm.
maybe low taxes. And I think that might be something that is going on there. But the fact that, they're, even when, Donnie, he calls his mom a bitch, and then she goes back in and she tells her husband about it, and she says, "Our son just called me a bitch." But she doesn't say it in like an angry way. She says it almost in
Right.
kind of a bemused way. And he just kind of like very calm. He's like, "You're not a bitch. You're bitching, but you're not a bitch." Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great line.
It's a great line. Yeah, he's got a lot of great lines in here. And then when they find out about him, talking back to the motivational speaker, when he talks back to Kitty Farmer, and Beth Grant in this movie as Kitty, she is just so funny.
Oh yeah.
And she just has this way about her. She plays like all these kind of like, she always plays like kind of like these, it's just like her air or something. She always plays like these kind of like right-wing conservative characters in a lot of movies. And and uh, and it's funny because her mom was like an activist for the Equal Rights Amendment, so it's like the complete
Right.
opposite of probably the type of home she grew up in. Um, but her line there when she says, she's like, "I'll tell you what he did. He told me to forcefully insert the textbook into my rectum."
And it's like, if I feel like they do a good job of showing Donnie's character because, it's not like he's just an asshole who doesn't want to do the work for no reason. Like when he's talking back to her in that exercise in class about, put love or, on the love or hate on the spectrum, and then
Love or fear,
talking
yeah.
back to, yeah, love or fear, and then Patrick Swayze's character when he's giving sort of bullshit advice to the kids, and then Donnie stands up and tries to give them some real advice. Like he does it in an abrasive way, but you can tell he's smart and he is actually trying to make good points. And that's his parents, I'm sure, recognize that in him, that he's a very smart, person. He's just thinking of things maybe a few steps beyond his teachers, and he doesn't know how to convey that in a polite way. So he just has an outburst.
There's also something else I noticed too this last viewing, which I never picked up on before, but in that scene I mentioned when he calls his mom a bitch, like she goes into his room and he's reading this very thick book, and he's like almost at the end. He's got like just like a small amount of pages left. And then when his mom goes into her bedroom, his dad is also reading a very thick book, but his dad is like the very beginning. So it's like not as much read.
Oh,
So it's just like this little interesting thing I picked up on, that I get the image of that Donnie is someone who is a really well-read kid. And I
yeah.
don't know if this was in the director's cut, but it was definitely, if it was in the theatrical cut, but I think it might have just been in the director's cut. But there's this one scene where the two teachers, the English teacher who's played by Drew Barrymore and the science teacher, they're sitting together in the teacher's lounge. And the science teacher like he like kind of like gives this little kind of like little chuckle, and he holds up a paper, and he says to Drew Barrymore, he's like, Donnie Darko, and she just kind of like smiles and she just nods, just like Donnie Darko, and just like this kind of knowing thing that like how smart he really is. And also we get when he's in the principal's office, the principal says like your scores are intimidating, right?
Yeah.
So it is this kind of thing where this is a very smart guy, and I think his parents kind of understand that, and they give him some leeway, and also they're willing to, like they said, when they go to when they're in that scene when they're at dinner together just by themselves, and she says, "I don't think telling a woman to shove a book up her ass is something we should let go," and then his dad's
Right.
just like, "I think we should buy him a moped."
Well, and I mean, if you want to relate it to superheroes, it's like you're saying, it's not a traditional superhero movie. There's not a guy who gets well, he sort of does, but he doesn't have a costume and there's not a big battle or anything like that. But he has sort of the archetype of the traditional hero character, especially if you're looking into more of like the Stan Lee characters like Peter Parker, who are outsiders, who are in a way more exceptional than their peers, but also looked down upon and are outcasts. And I feel like Donnie fits that mold very well, where he sort of knows more and can see more than his classmates in a lot of different ways, but also he's dismissed because he is different and not fitting in with the mold of the whole school and what they're going for. So I feel like in that sense that he very is much relatable to some of the traditional like superhero archetypes.
Yeah, there is definite Peter Parker coding going on here. And it's funny, this comes out in 2001, which was the same year that Ultimate Spider-Man began. And
Yep.
the two, I don't think there could have been any cross influence because they're basically coming out at the exact same time. But there is like some, like you can see that kind of like millennial angst type of thing playing out in Donnie and also playing out in the Ultimate version of Peter
Hmm.
Parker that I was really kind of jiving with. And it's funny because at one point there was a question over whether Tobey Maguire would have been able to be in Spider-Man 2 because he had injured himself on the set of
Yeah.
Seabiscuit. And there were serious talks, I believe, like this is like half remembered stuff from like 20 years ago, but I
Yep. I've heard
believe
this too. Yeah.
yeah, I believe there were serious talks at the time about Jake Gyllenhaal possibly coming in to replace Tobey Maguire. And
Yeah.
honestly, I feel like in an alternate universe, there is an alternate universe somewhere out there where Jake Gyllenhaal played Spider-Man instead of Tobey Maguire. And I really get the feeling that Gyllenhaal probably would have done a better job of it. Like as much as I love Tobey
Yeah.
Maguire, I just feel like the kind of like Spidey snark and that kind of aspect of it, I don't feel he could capture that very well. Whereas I feel like Gyllenhaal could definitely have done that.
Yeah, and by the time those movies came around, Tobey Maguire never read to me as a high school student. So I feel like, especially in that first one, just watching this movie, Jake Gyllenhaal really fit into that high school environment a lot better. So yeah, I would have loved to see that. I think he probably would have been a better Peter Parker as much as I love those movies. So it would definitely be interesting to see a version of that. And for all we know, I mean, those rumors are probably true, and it might have been, this movie that caught people's eye in terms of like Sony who were looking at him for the role. And, they probably saw him in this, and that might have been what triggered them to think that.
I'd imagine so because yeah, this came out because Spider-Man came out 2002, so then Spider-Man 2 came out in what, like 2004, I think, around
Yeah.
there. So
Yep.
yeah, it definitely, and this feels like this was a big movie for Gyllenhaal's career. We're gonna take a
Hmm.
quick break and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about this. We all love superhero movies and TV shows, but what about the comics that inspired them? Marvel, DC, Image, and more have provided the template for the movies and shows we all enjoy watching, and it's important to honor that tradition by buying and reading comic books. Superhero Cinephiles is proud to be an affiliate of mycomicshop.com. It began as a small mail-order business operated by junior high school student Buddy Saunders all the way back in 1960, and has been operating on the internet since 1997. My Comic Shop has new releases, value packs, back issues, trade paperbacks, comic art, regular auctions, and a whole lot more, including 35% discounts on pre-orders. You can also sell your own comics or utilize their consignment services. You can even create your own want list of comics you're searching for. To get started, check out our affiliate link in the show notes or on the superherocinephiles.com homepage. Blast off into a new universe with Corsairs, a new sci-fi space opera serial by me, Percival Constantine. In these adventures, join the crew of the Corsair, a group of intergalactic mercenaries, as they struggle to survive in the depths of corporate-controlled space. If you're a fan of Firefly, Cowboy Bebop, or Guardians of the Galaxy, then you're going to love Corsairs. Subscribers to my Patreon get 2 new episodes a week, while free members get 1 new episode a week starting in December. Patreon offers new subscribers a 7-day free trial, but I'm also throwing in another perk. If you sign up with the coupon code SCP, you'll get 90% off your first month. So visit patreon.com/Percival Constantine and join in the adventures. And we are back, still talking about Donnie Darko. Now, one of the things that I will push back a little bit on, and this is because this is a difference from the theatrical cut and the director's cut, is there's a scene in the director's cut where his doctor, in the last visit with his doctor, she tells him, you can stop taking your pills. They're just placebos. Right? So basically, she says, like, you're not crazy. You're not a paranoid schizophrenic. There's nothing wrong with you at all. So he doesn't really have mental illness, which I think also plays into just this kind of tendency, especially in this generation, to kind of like over medicate kids and kind of like, the whole era of the helicopter parents and all that really came out of
Right.
Was really the thing back in these days. And so while his parents are understanding of him, I don't feel like they understand him, which is why they're having him go to the doctor and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean they have as supportive as they seem to be in certain ways, ultimately their answers to some of the biggest problems are just buy him new stuff. I mean, when the his sister is talking about one time, his parents bought him a whole new set of stuff for his room, and every time he gets in trouble. So they seem to feel that, when they run out of ideas on how to help him, ultimately money and things is the only solution that they really can come up with at the end of the day, which obviously is not resonating with him. He doesn't really seem interested in material things like that. So for whatever reason, they feel like that maybe will make him happier, and it's clearly not working to any degree.
Yeah, and not only that, but also the whole idea of having him go to therapy too, because when in that opening scene, right, when he talks about going to therapy, he mentions the fact that they're paying $200 an hour for this therapist.
Right.
And so it is kind of this idea of they just keep throwing money at the problem and hoping that money will solve it, which definitely fits for this era it's set in as well. And I think it could also be another commentary about like middle class suburbia and the Republican era and the Reagan era.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to see, in the ways he's detached, but also the things that get him interested. Like he's very clued on and interested in the older woman who they call Grandma Death, and he gets very excited learning about her and the book she wrote, potentially because it might have some answers to whatever he's experiencing. But he sort of seems to come alive in those moments when he's asking the science teacher questions about her and how the mechanics of time travel work. And there's like a light in his eyes and like a pep in him that is missing from other moments in the movie where he's just, walking through the hallways and at home at dinner where he's sort of sullen and downtrodden. So he plays that, Jake Gyllenhaal plays that really well. He comes alive in these different key moments in the movie.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well. Throughout most of the movie, he's got kind of like this sullen disposition, but there are those brief moments when something else happens to pull him out of it. And sometimes in explosive ways too. And like
Yeah.
I still think that the exchange between his friends and the Smurf discussion is just hilarious because he gets like almost offended at their
Right.
at their little fan theory that the Smurfs are all banging Smurfette and then Papa Smurf is
Yeah.
filming the gangbang. And then he has this whole and he brings out logic and he brings out the all these types of all this stuff lore from Smurfs lore to prove them wrong. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
this feels like those kinds of arguments that I remember having back in the days of the AOL message boards back then.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like, what would be a throwaway joke to most kids, he takes, very seriously. And there's good and bad sides of that, as we all know online, where people get into heated arguments and serious arguments about, fictional characters and things like that. But it is funny in that moment to see the way that's a good insight into how his brain works. And even this group of friends that you presume, he's able to relate to them to a certain degree more than other kids in school. He is even different from the friend group that he hangs out with because he doesn't have that same level of humor that they share.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, DeVay Chase in this, like this is from The Ring eventually would be her eventual claim to fame. So I was surprised. I didn't realize that at the time, or even just last night watching this, but I was just looking at it, and I saw her name pop up. Like, wait, I know that name from somewhere. And
There's a
yeah, that
lot
was
of surprising people in this movie. The further
Seth
you go
Rogen.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, his friend's name is Seth in this movie.
Right.
But also Mary McDonnell, who, probably most people mostly familiar with her from Battlestar Galactica. She played the
Yep.
president in that. Maggie Gyllenhaal, obviously. Patrick Swayze, also obvious too. But also the guy who plays Frank, I didn't realize this, but he's James Duvall, and he was in Independence Day. He was like Randy Quaid's son in Independence Day,
Oh.
I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I didn't clock him in anything else I've seen. So yeah, that's interesting.
I didn't until I just because I saw his name and I was wondering if he was related to Robert Duvall, but he spells it differently. And then I saw that he
Oh,
was in Independence Day, and I realized like, oh yeah, that's right. I do remember him now in that. Um, Jenna Malone as well, right? And Drew
yeah.
Barrymore, of course, too, who actually helped fund this movie. So her production company like put up the funding to get this movie made. So she
Interesting.
really helped bring it. Yeah. Um, but yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the and we mentioned Beth Grant before as well. But I want to talk a little bit about the whole idea of Jim Cunningham, the Patrick Swayze character. It's funny. I was watching this now, and when I was watching it back then at the time, my thought process was, I can't believe that Kitty Farmer still believes he's innocent. And she thinks it's some conspiracy. I'm like, come on, it's obvious the guy's a pedophile. And now I look at what we're dealing with in the Epstein files and the Trump stuff, and I'm just like, wait a minute. Republicans trying to justify someone's pedophilia does not seem that out of the realm of
Yeah.
possibility now.
Yeah, it's like I don't know what it is, but it's I guess certain people when they come out so strongly for a uh authority figure, and I guess they vouch for them in some way, part of them feels like they can't admit that person did anything wrong as if it would be a reflection on them, to say like, well, she obviously didn't know about this dark secret he had, but she can't bring herself to admit that it might be true. I think because she would feel that would reflect poorly on her own character, that she didn't have the foresight and the judgment to clock that this man wasn't who he said he was. And I feel like, in our modern political climate, it's some of that, and it's also people, willing to put up with some evil if it helps get them the things they want. I don't know if that's so much what is, her character is speaking to, but yeah, it's very, very scary to see how much people are willing to either forgive or completely ignore or just pretend the opposite is true, just in pursuit of whatever they want for their own, goals or whatever it may be.
Yeah, also just her self-righteousness like is entirely consistent throughout the entire movie. Even in ways when it's so obvious that she's in the wrong, right? When she's like
Yep.
when the mother who's Rose, she tells her that the PTA meeting, she's like, I don't think the PTA should be banning books. And again, I'm like at the time I'm like, well, yeah, obviously, who's going to disagree with that? Well, look at what we're
Yep.
dealing with now. But also she calls out, and the thing is, the because her daughter doesn't actually read the book at all. That's the kind of the
Right.
joke. It's like she doesn't do the assignment at all. So it also feels like this kind of way of her saying like this kind of arrogance of parents that they think that they know better than the teachers, and they think that if their kid is in trouble, then that means that it's the teacher's fault. It's not the kid's fault. It's not the parents' fault. There's a bit of that happens in the case of Donnie. It is actually somewhat true. But
Yeah.
in the case of her daughter, it's not. But just like her arrogance, how she thinks that she is the pinnacle of everything. She's like, I crossed the parent teacher divide because I'm a teacher here and I have a student here. I have a
Right.
child in this school. And then, and then she's telling to Rose, she's like, I question your abilities as a mother. It's like, whoa, bitch, back off there.
Yeah. And this is another example where you could sort of read into the movie that Donnie is a little more perceptive than everyone else. I mean, on a literal plot level, the wormhole tendrils or Frank or whatever it may be sort of guide him to and influence him to burn down Cunningham's house, which is how the secret gets discovered. But you could also read that as maybe Donnie inherently knows that this guy is bad, and he is choosing to do something to expose him. So, regardless of how you want to read it, it's Donnie is the one who is bringing some of these things to light that everyone else is either choosing to ignore or not smart enough to figure out on their own.
No, I think that's a good point too. And I think that especially with how he reacts to Cunningham and how he doesn't
Right.
react in the same way to other people, right? Like, he has that exchange with Kitty and he tells her to shove the book up her ass, but we never see him like getting worked up about that. He never even mentions it again. He just, it was just something he did. But with
Hmm.
Cunningham, like there's a scene with him and Gretchen right after, and he's like very visibly upset and
Oh
like,
yeah.
practically screaming about what a fraud this guy is and how full of shit he is. And I think that, yeah, I think there is some insight that he has that there is something wrong about this guy. There's just something, and it's more than just the typical bullshit that you deal with here.
Yeah, and when Jim is speaking to the school, he has such, like easy, simple answers to everyone's problems, and I feel like Donnie just knows life is more complex, and you're not just going to get an easy answer from a guy like this who doesn't really want to understand what you're trying to say when the kids are talking to him. He's not really listening to what they are saying to him. He's sort of just giving, verbatim answers that are from his book or his speeches or whatever it may be. And Donnie is, in his own abrasive way, he is more clued into what the kids are asking for help with.
Yeah, it's very much he's speaking these platitudes and they're very vague and they could apply to almost like any situation. He basically says the same thing in each case.
Hmm.
And then Donnie's the kids are eating it up for the most part, right? Each of the three kids they get excited when they go called down to the stage, and then Donnie's just like, wait, everything you just said is bullshit. Doesn't anybody else realize that? It's like that it's like that famous um scene in Zoolander, right? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Doesn't everybody else see what's
Yeah.
going on here? um and also the political side of thing I thought was an interesting idea, and I keep every time I've seen this movie I've tried to wrap my head around what's the importance of setting it during the 88 election, and I still don't know if I have a good answer to that question. I mean, I think part of it is like what I said before. And Richard Kelly, just to clarify here, he said that he wasn't making a political statement with this movie,
Hmm.
and he was just kind of reflecting the kind of home he grew up in, which was like, Republican parents, but they ended up raising a liberal family. Which I think was probably a case for a lot of millennials, because that was definitely the case in my house. Like my parents were super Reagan fans, and then my sister and I
Hmm.
became Bernie Sanders supporters. So, um, but and I but I also was thinking about the fact that Frank talks about how the world is going to end and all that in 28 days, and the timeline doesn't exactly work out, right? But the fact that, and there's also the repeating number 88, because apparently what he says there in the 28 days, the 6 hours, whatever, apparently you add all those individual numbers together, it adds up to 88 as well. It's
Oh,
like the
interesting.
number 88 repeats in the movie, um which is also, eight is, basically, uh it's like a up it's horse if you put it, if you lay it out differently, it's the infinity symbol.
Right.
So that's something else to look at it that way. but but also I was thinking about the fact, and I remember, the end of the Cold War, right? And George H.W. Bush's famous, speech about the a new world order and all the talk about the end of history and all that. And it's kind of a reach because like I said, the numbers don't add up, but I feel like there is something there as well about the fact that this end of an era type of thing that is coming.
Yeah, I could see that as well. Like, and even from a more personal level, anytime you have a writer of a story writing a story like this, it always seems like it could be read as the end of an era for the country, or also the end of an era for the creator's like childhood. If he grew up during this time and then he has to go out in the real world, I think we all feel a little bit like that. We remember, especially if you had a good childhood, you remember those days, and it almost feels like a different world or a different lifetime. And once you enter adulthood, it's like that old world you knew was dead, and you're in a new world now with new problems and challenges, and you can never go back. And I feel like that's some of what this movie is about too, like trying to go with the whole time travel aspect, like wanting to like go back and fix things and maybe do things a different way, and maybe there'd be a different outcome if you just made a different decision. So I feel like that's all in there, both from a high level political angle and also maybe like more of a personal level too.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely. Um, what about so let's talk about the time travel aspect, or just like the kind of the and how it affects the movie as a whole. What's kind of like your read on all that? Is there anything about it that it still just kind of like stands out to you as making a lot of sense or not making a lot of sense? What do you think about that whole thing?
It's made more sense to me from reading about it. I always like stories where sort of like a Wizard of Oz thing where there are these fantastical elements that later on are revealed to be more grounded things in the world. Like Frank is this enigmatic, sort of scary figure, and then it's revealed at the end there is actually a real Frank who's his sister's boyfriend. Some like how some of the characters in The Wizard of Oz are just representations of her family members. So I always like when a story does that, where it sort of blends reality and a dream world where there are mysterious things, but you can also pinpoint it to have an explanation and say, maybe this strange bunny man is real, or maybe it's just a figment of his imagination and it's sort of some part of his psyche dealing with his sister's boyfriend or something like that. So that aspect of it I enjoy. And then for the time travel of it all, yeah, I sort of read it as the moment the plane crashes into their house, he's sort of in this new reality that he has to close the loop on by sending the engine back, and that ends up killing him, but it ends up saving the world for whatever reason. A lot of readings I've seen of it say that basically the whole movie is in a parallel universe that's sort of unstable, and it's Donnie's job to set things right and close the loop and ensure that that plane crashes as it's supposed to, which will end up killing him, but it will save his family. It'll save the world. So that's also another interesting sort of, I don't know if you want to say like a Christ allegory or a superhero allegory where the hero has to die for the greater good of humanity.
Well, yeah, there are some religious aspects in there too that I want to talk about as well. But yeah, the basically the when Donnie we don't know like what causes this. It's what Roberto Sparrow's book calls a tangent universe.
Right.
And the whole idea is that the tangent universe, when it's created, it's like a break from the primary universe, I think it's called. And um and the tangent universe, it will be so unstable that it will only sustain itself for a few weeks and then it will collapse in on itself. And then it can form a black hole, and that could also take the primary universe and all of existence with it as well. Um so when a tangent universe happens, those living closest to it, they become kind of like the center of it. And there is a the kind of like the living receiver is the guide who has to get this artifact into place so that and send it back to the primary universe. Um and that will allow them to that will cause the tangent universe to end, and it will also and it will preserve the primary universe. And also they mentioned how that the living receiver has fourth dimensional powers. So increased strength, telekinesis, mind control, the ability to conjure fire and water, and is often tormented by terrifying dreams, visions, and auditory hallucinations during his time within the Tangent universe. Um, and then those surrounding the living receiver, known as the manipulated, will fear him and try to destroy him. And then you also have the manipulated dead, who, and the two types of manipulated. There's the manipulated living, who are around there, and their goal is to kind of like guide the receiver into returning the artifact, and basically trying to do anything to save themselves from oblivion. And then the manipulated dead, they are able to contact the living receiver. So Frank is the manipulated dead, and then he now goes beyond time, and that's why he can come back in
Right.
time and serve as a guide to Donnie. And so basically the whole thing is like Donnie's goal is to send this jet engine back to the primary universe, and then for him to be crushed by it, and then that will save it. And now here's where things get confusing for me. Like that's kind of like the official explanation. But
Right.
one of the things I don't understand is, if the plane engine crashes anyway, why is Donnie the one who has to send it through? Where's the plane engine coming from? How that gets there, that is something that still just doesn't really make sense to me in a lot of it.
Yeah, it's one of those time travel conundrums where the thing couldn't exist without the time travel taking place to begin with. Like I don't know if you watched Lost, but I remember there was a section in Lost where the characters are traveling through time and they kept passing this like compass to each other. And there was no origin point for the compass because it was being passed in between these two characters traveling through time. So like someone would go eventually catch up with the person who was time traveling and it would hand off to them. But it was just being handed between these two people as they passed each other through time. And there was no way for that compass to exist outside of that loop that they were created for themselves. And it's sort of the same thing here. Like there's no way for this artifact to exist without the loop happening in the first place. So it's a very interesting aspect of time travel stories that I see come up every now and then. But yeah, I don't have an explanation for it either. And I don't know if I presume it's something the writers thought about, but I don't know if there is an aspect of time travel like in the scientific community that, where they look at wormholes and things like that. I don't know if there is any sort of explanation out there for how something like this could actually be possible.
Yeah, the paradoxes and time travel movies go together like
Yep.
fire and gasoline. Like it's just, even the best ones, like Back to the Future, it's got tons of
Oh yeah.
paradoxes in
Riddled
that.
with
Like the whole,
issues, yeah.
yeah, I mean the whole idea of him going back in time and giving Chuck Berry the idea for Johnny Be Good, but he only knows that song because Chuck Berry made that song. So now the song has no origin point within Back
Right.
to the Future. Or the or also if you believe in yourself, you can do anything, which Doc Brown tells Marty, right? Jennifer says that Doc
Hmm.
Brown is the one who told him that. And then later he tells it to his father, and then his father gives him that advice. It's like, I've always told you, right? And it's like, okay, so now
Yeah.
that line has no origin point. The Terminator, right? There's no fate but what we make. But if he doesn't come back, if John tells that to Reese, and then Reese goes back and tells that to Sarah, who then tells it to John, but even John Connor himself, like he can't exist unless we have Reese coming back in time
Right.
to father him. So yeah,
Right. So
the
how could he have been whatever the original timeline was, it would be
Mhm.
impossible for him to exist. Yeah.
Right, yeah, yeah. The only well, also the famous, would you kill Hitler as a baby if you could travel in time? Well, the problem is if you go and kill Hitler as a baby, if you travel in time, then you don't know that Hitler is a problem, so you don't have to travel in time to kill Hitler.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for time travel stories, I tend to like the way that they handle it in things like Avengers Endgame, where when you travel back in time, you're not actually altering the future you came from. The second you go back and change something, you're split off into an alternate timeline where you don't know what the events of that future is going to be, but it can't affect the future that you came from, the moment you change something.
I was gonna say the only two movies where time that I've seen where time travel makes sense. I've heard Primer is very good too, but I haven't seen that. The only two I've
Yeah.
seen where the time travel actually makes sense is Avengers Endgame. That is one, and that comes out of those are Mark Grunwald's rules of time travel back in the old in the Marvel
Oh yeah.
comics in the 70s and the 80s. Yeah, he came up with this idea that if you're gonna go back in time, then it creates a branch universe. Um, there's a whole discussion about it in the Hulk Future Imperfect thing when Hulk threatens to kill himself so the Maestro won't exist. And then, Maestro says, but I'm not, it doesn't matter because I'm in a different timeline from you. And then
Right.
later on, Hulk admits, he's like, yeah, I was bullshitting him just to see if he'd buy it, but he was right. Um, but also, yeah, that whole idea that makes sense because then you don't get any paradoxes. It's just anytime you go back
Yep.
in time, you create a branch universe. And also Your Name. I don't know if you ever saw that anime, but that also
No.
had it's a really good movie. And it also has an explanation for time travel that works very well. And it's kind of like the inverted Mobius strip. So it's like these two things are you have these kind of like two different realities kind of existing simultaneously, and they intersect at certain points in the movie, and
Okay.
actually makes it make sense in that context. Which is also
Interesting.
why I think the double eight is useful here, thinking about the infinity symbol. So that could also be an example of like a Mobius strip and an inverted Mobius strip, and these two things, interacting
Yeah.
together. But yeah, that part of it. But as for the religious stuff of it, I think it is interesting too, because we have this part where he's talking with his science teacher, and he mentions something about like God being the guide of all this, and the teacher says we have to stop this discussion right now because I could lose my job for talking about religious stuff
Yep.
with you. um but then, and I don't know if this was in the theatrical cut, but in the director's cut, definitely, his doctor has this little aside that she tells him. She says, "You're not an atheist, Donnie. You're an agnostic, right? An atheist denies the existence of God, but an agnostic thinks that the believes God could exist and doesn't deny the possibility that God could exist, but also believes there's never going to be any evidence to prove his existence."
Right.
And so I thought that was those two things jumped out at me more this time than the last time. And I think the religious significance that you touched upon earlier, I think that plays into it as well. And maybe that is also kind of the director saying, don't try to overthink the time travel stuff too much.
Yeah, I think that's how this movie works best. Like, it's cool if you're into that and want to figure out how all the pieces work together, but I think it helps that the rest of the movie is strong enough and the characters are and the dialogue is interesting enough that even if it all doesn't make sense in the end, there's a lot of different ways you could read this movie that are beyond the literal mechanics of how the science fiction elements work. Similar to a David Lynch movie where you could try to pick apart Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive and figure out exactly how certain dreams or entities are interacting with the real world. But at a certain point, I think it's better just to let it wash over you because it's not really trying to be that type of movie. It's not like it's like Tenet or like a Christopher Nolan movie where it's very much about explaining to the audience the cool sci-fi concept and then showing you how the characters are going to interact with that.
Mm,
It's not that type of movie. It's more of a character sort of first movie.
yeah. It's funny. Have you ever seen the movie Gozu?
No.
Okay, so it's a Japanese movie, very trippy. And
Okay.
I was trying to explain it to a friend of mine after I showed it to her. And I was trying to go through all this stuff, and she just like she held up her hand, she's like, don't. Just don't explain it. And so that stuck out to me. And I think there is something to be said about that. Just like don't try to over explain it, just experience it. And I think there is something to that aspect of it too.
Yeah, I think certain movies just work better that way. Like I just referenced Mulholland Drive, but I've read many explanations for that movie, and now when I watch it, it actually makes perfect sense to me and seems almost very simple in terms of what's going on. And I almost preferred it the first few times I watched it, where I didn't really know because it seems a little more, I don't know, benign to me now, where I'm just like, oh, well, this scene is sort of creepy or weird, but I know it's actually because this is happening in the background. So yeah, for certain things, I feel like it works just to not try to figure it out too much.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I go back to that first viewing of Mulholland Drive and just how blown away I was. And and then after explaining it and at first being like, oh my God, that's really cool. And then
Yeah,
watching it again after that and just being like, well, it was kind of better when I didn't know what the hell was going on here.
yeah. I find that tends to be true for a lot of things. I've referenced Lost a couple times too. Like it's always more fun, I think, in the beginning when your mind is allowing you to sort of explore all these avenues for what could be happening. And then once you read, like, no, it's actually just this one thing, it sort of locks out all those other possibilities you had in your mind, which I think is sometimes more fun to watch. Your mind works a little bit more when you're exploring all these different possibilities for different things.
No, I agree. My go-to example of that is Wolverine's origin story when,
Oh,
they and it's when I read that the origin comic and I'm like, it's not a bad comic. It's well written and
no.
everything, but it's just kind of like it feels like there's something mythic that was lost when we kind of locked in that origin story. And
Yeah,
whereas when it
exactly.
was still kind of when there was still some mystery there, it was a lot more fun to think about. And now it's like, well, we don't have to think about it anymore. So
Yeah,
it is
exactly.
what it is. Yeah. But yeah, I think this movie it's good to think about it that way too, and not to stress too much over some of those little specifics about it. But is there anything else you wanted to mention about this movie? That was kind of like the main things I wanted to touch on myself.
Um, no, I just think if you haven't seen it again, it's a really unique experience. I mean, we've compared it to David Lynch and a few other things, but I don't really think it's quite like any other movie I've seen. And there's a lot of aspects of it where I could have seen a version of this movie that was just awful and not good at all. But I feel like the writing in particular, like we referenced a couple of the dialogue scenes where there's just some really interesting and smart writing, not only between, Donnie and other characters, but between the adults. And I like how the movie focuses a lot on both the adults in the situations and the teenagers. I feel like a lot of movies you see like this, it's very much from solely the perspective of like high school movies are usually just about the perspective of the kids and how they're reacting to either the teachers or their parents. And this movie doesn't really do that. It shows you really a lot of different sides of this town and the people who live in it.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And of course, as we all know, this then the TVA letter came up, so we wouldn't have to deal with all this.
Yeah.
And and Donnie Darko ended up becoming a variant became Quentin Beck in another world.
Yeah.
All right. But yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. And yeah, I agree. It's a movie that I don't revisit a lot, but when I did last year for my class and when I did, last night for this episode, it's a good movie to revisit. It is fun to watch, and it is interesting to see just like how far some of these actors have come since this movie too.
Yeah, and there is a sequel with Davi Chase, and I watched it one time a long time ago. It is not good, so
That's what I've
definitely
heard.
I would
Yeah.
say avoid that one. Yeah,
Yeah, and Richard Kelly, who wrote and directed this, he said he had no involvement in that, and he because he doesn't have the rights to it. However, he did say in 2021 that there is work on a new sequel, and this would
interesting.
probably ignore the He said in January 2021, he said an enormous amount of work had been done on the script. He was inspired to do so after a 2010 meeting with James Cameron, who found the film disturbing and had Kelly explain what happened to Donnie at the end of the film. Cameron suggested to Kelly that he continue working on the project, which made Kelly realize that there was really something big, something epic that could be done. But
Interesting.
there has not been anything else, as far as I know, that's been said about it in the past, what, like 5 years since then. So I
Yeah.
have no idea if that's still the case. I have no idea what the rights situation is with this. But yeah, I've never seen S Darko, but my understanding is that it is garbage, and DeVay Chase and the producer are the only links between it and the original, really.
Yeah, I like I said, I rented it at one point. I think it was a direct to DVD sequel,
Yeah, I believe
if I
so.
recall. So yeah.
Okay. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on. And why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Sure. I mostly use Blue Sky these days, so I'm at mattfarley.bluesky.com or however they handle their tags there. My user's Matt Farley. So yeah, if you want to follow me there, I'm on Instagram at mattfarley.writes. If you want to follow me there as well and follow updates about my book, I'll be posting all that good stuff there.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have links to that stuff in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out. As for us, superherocinefiles.com is the website. We are superherocinefiles.com on Blue Sky, Super Cinema Pod on Instagram and Threads, though Blue Sky is where you can find me most days. Also, please make sure to check out our sponsor links, including my Substack, which you can find at pulpcorner.substack.com. You sign up there, you can get some free stories, and find out some more stuff about that I'm working on. And I've got some superhero stuff coming up on there in the near future myself. So please make sure to check that out. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.